On September 2, 1945, the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay was packed with Allied commanders. After the most devastating conflict in human history, the watching world expected a retributive spectacle. Troops and politicians alike demanded the ultimate theatrical humiliation of the defeated Japanese Empire. But when General Douglas MacArthur stepped to the microphone, the fiery speech of conquest never came. His tone was shockingly subdued, almost philosophical. The righteous vengeance that so many anticipated simply did not happen. This abrupt restraint, however, was not a sudden bout of mercy. It was a cold, calculated maneuver. This deliberate suppression of victory theater was a masterclass in psychological statecraft, engineered to secure immediate control over a shattered, volatile empire. We are going to dismantle the popular, sanitized myths of the surrender deck to expose the pragmatic, highly sensitive mechanics of transitioning from total war to total occupation. For the millions of Allied citizens and frontline soldiers who had endured years of atrocities, the emotional demand to see the architects of the Pacific War publicly broken was overwhelming. But political necessity dictated a far colder logic. The central puzzle of September 1945 was not how to punish a defeated enemy, but how to effectively manage their survival. How did MacArthur transform the ultimate military triumph into an act of strict, bureaucratic restraint? And why was actively shielding Japan's highest leaders from public degradation the absolute prerequisite for safely occupying a nation of 70 million people? The answers are rooted not in sudden American benevolence, but in logistics and calculated risk. To understand the meticulously choreographed, bloodless ceremony that unfolded on the deck of the Missouri, we must first look at the terrifying mathematical reality the American command faced in the anxious weeks leading up to the surrender. By late August 1945, the Allied thirst for vengeance was a palpable, volcanic force. Years of brutal, island-hopping combat in the Pacific, defined by no-quarter engagements and the harrowing realities of prisoner-of-war camps, had generated an intense domestic and military demand for retribution. The American public, fueled by wartime propaganda and the undeniable shock of Pearl Harbor, largely viewed the Japanese not just as military adversaries, but as an existential enemy that needed to be utterly crushed. The prevailing sentiment among many frontline soldiers and politicians in Washington was that the surrender should be a visceral, public breaking of the Japanese spirit, a humiliating spectacle that would cement American dominance and ensure the militaristic culture was destroyed forever. However, General Douglas MacArthur, newly appointed as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, found himself staring down a logistical puzzle that made emotional vengeance a dangerous luxury. The reality on the ground was terrifying. MacArthur was tasked with occupying a fanatically resilient archipelago that had been structurally and economically ruined by strategic bombing, yet still possessed millions of armed, trained, and highly disciplined soldiers. The initial American occupation force landing in Japan was relatively small, a vanguard of tens of thousands stepping onto the home islands of a nation of 70 million. These early occupying troops were walking into a heavily militarized, hostile nation whose populace fully expected to be slaughtered. For years, Japanese state media had warned civilians that an American invasion would bring unimaginable atrocities. The imperial government had been preparing the population for Operation Ketsugo, the decisive, final battle, mobilizing militias and embedding the concept of national suicide into the defense strategy. The sudden cessation of hostilities did not erase this deeply ingrained psychological conditioning. The Japanese military command structure remained largely intact, and the populace was anxious, fearful, and poised on a knife edge. MacArthur recognized that this was a volatile equation. If he dismantled the imperial structure entirely and publicly humiliated the Japanese leadership, specifically the emperor, he would instantly validate the worst fears of the Japanese population. A theatrical display of vengeance would not secure the peace. It would almost certainly trigger a massive, unmanageable insurgency. The American forces, vastly outnumbered in those critical early weeks, would find themselves bogged down in a guerrilla war across a devastated mountainous country, suffering casualties that a war-weary American public would never tolerate. The Supreme Commander understood that his primary weapon in this precarious environment could not be brute force alone. Instead, restraint had to be weaponized as an instrument of mass psychological control. MacArthur needed the existing Japanese governmental apparatus, including the emperor, to legitimize the occupation and maintain civic order. He needed the defeated leadership to issue the orders for demobilization, to handle the administrative burdens of a ruined economy, and to ensure that the millions of Japanese troops scattered across the home islands and the Pacific Theater laid down their arms without a fight. This strategy required a calculated, almost bureaucratic detachment. The goal was to project absolute, undeniable authority without resorting to the kind of punitive degradation that would incite rebellion. MacArthur had to manage the expectations of his own vengeful troops while simultaneously signaling to the Japanese that cooperation, rather than resistance, was their only path to survival. The surrender, therefore, had to be a meticulously controlled event, a legal and administrative transfer of power rather than a conqueror's parade. It was a strategy born of logistical necessity and command strategy, acknowledging that the real challenge was not winning the war, but securing the peace with an alarmingly small force in a highly hostile environment. This precarious strategy of psychological restraint was put to its first extreme test the moment the enemy set foot on American steel. At 8:56 on the morning of September 2nd, a small launch pulled alongside the starboard ladder of the USS Missouri. Out of the craft stepped an 11-man Japanese delegation, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu. As they climbed to the veranda deck, the physical reality of the moment was stark. Shigemitsu, wearing a formal top hat and morning coat, struggled up the steel steps, leaning heavily on a wooden cane due to an artificial leg, a remnant of a 1932 assassination attempt in Shanghai. Beside him, General Umezu, representing the Imperial General Headquarters, wore an unadorned olive-drab uniform, his face locked in rigid, expressionless immobility. They stepped onto a warship crammed with thousands of American sailors and hundreds of Allied officers who had fought them across the Pacific. The physical proximity of bitter enemies meeting face-to-face in tight quarters created an atmosphere of unbearable tension where a single misinterpretation of body language could spark an international incident. In the decades following the war, popular legend often exaggerated the dramatic tension of this arrival, claiming that a defiant Japanese general stubbornly refused to salute or bow to the Allied commanders, attempting to assert a final moment of samurai pride on an American deck. But the primary documentary record tells a much colder, more disciplined story. Archival footage and official logs confirm there was no theatrical defiance, nor was there any demand for prostration. Instead, what unfolded was a rigidly choreographed, heavy diplomatic silence. As the delegation reached the upper deck, they formed two neat ranks and stood at attention. General Umezu did not refuse a mandated bow. Rather, standard military protocol for a surrender of this nature dictated a neutral, professional salute between combatants, not an act of feudal submission. Both sides were strictly operating under the terms of international military law, not theatrical conquest. General Douglas MacArthur understood the explosive potential of this silent confrontation. From his position on the deck, he deliberately ignored any perceived rigidity or coldness in the Japanese posture. He refused to allow his own officers to indulge in verbal taunts, triumphant gestures, or prolonged stares. Instead, MacArthur strictly enforced a swift, business-like protocol designed to neutralize emotion entirely. The Japanese delegates were guided directly to their designated positions opposite the surrender table, without delay or ceremonial flourish. By treating the arrival as a cold administrative procedure rather than a conqueror's parade, MacArthur successfully navigated the most volatile moment of the morning. With the delegation brought to the table without a single incident of escalation, the Supreme Commander initiated his absolute micromanagement of the surrender process itself. The silence on the veranda deck of the USS Missouri was heavy, broken only by the mechanical whir of film cameras and the rhythmic slap of dark water against the battleship's steel hull. As the Japanese delegation stood frozen before the surrender table, they found themselves engulfed in a meticulously engineered theater of power. MacArthur did not need to hurl insults, demand prostration, or orchestrate a verbal show trial, because the physical environment he had constructed was already doing the psychological work for him. The choice of the Missouri was officially framed as a political nod to President Harry Truman's home state, but tactically, it was a colossal projection of industrial supremacy. The Iowa-class battleship displaced over 45,000 tons of armor and machinery. Directly above the delegation loomed the ship's massive 16-inch gun turrets, their barrels elevated toward the gray, overcast sky, casting long, oppressive shadows over the wooden deck. But the flagship was merely the focal point of a much larger psychological weapon. Filling the entirety of Tokyo Bay, stretching to the horizon in every direction, was the greatest naval armada ever assembled in human history. Over 250 Allied warships, aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and submarines sat at anchor in the enemy's home waters. The sky above was thick with the low, continuous drone of hundreds of carrier-based fighter planes waiting in holding patterns. For a Japanese military command that had watched its own combined fleet be systematically hunted and annihilated across the Pacific, standing in the exact center of this intact, overwhelming industrial juggernaut was a crushing physical realization of their absolute defeat. MacArthur amplified this effect through the sheer density of human placement. The veranda deck was not cordoned off to provide a polite, private space for a diplomatic meeting. It was suffocatingly packed. Thousands of American sailors crowded every square inch of the available superstructure, clinging to anti-aircraft gun mounts, radar masts, and bulkheads, staring downward in absolute disciplined silence. Hundreds of Allied officers, representing nations from across the globe, formed a tight, unyielding perimeter around the green baize-covered table. The Japanese delegates were physically boxed in by the very men they had fought, starved, and imprisoned. By relying on this undeniable, towering architecture of American military might, the Supreme Commander rendered verbal abuse entirely unnecessary. The crushing, disciplined silence of the Allied ranks was far more intimidating than any victory chant. To fully grasp the tension of these initial minutes, it is necessary to understand the profound psychological terror gripping the men in the top hats and olive drab uniforms. The Japanese delegation had not arrived on the Missouri to negotiate. They had arrived expecting a slaughter, or, at the very least, severe and immediate humiliation. Toshikazu Kase, a high-ranking foreign ministry official standing just steps behind the lead delegates, would later document the excruciating dread that consumed them during the long boat ride across the bay. In his private diary, Kase described feeling as though they were being led to a public execution, noting that the thousands of unblinking Allied eyes beating down on them felt like a barrage of physical arrows. The Imperial General Headquarters had been so certain that the American command would use this moment to arrest the emissaries, subject them to a drumhead court-martial, or publicly strip them of their honors, that it had been nearly impossible to find officers willing to attend. General Yoshijiro Umezu, the hardened chief of the Army General Staff, had violently refused the assignment, threatening to commit ritual suicide rather than endure the disgrace of surrendering in person to an American general. It had taken a direct, personal mandate from Emperor Hirohito himself to force Umezu onto the launch. As they stood before the table, every sudden flash of a photographer's bulb, every subtle shift in the posture of the surrounding American military police triggered the expectation of violence. They were men operating under the intense, fatalistic conditioning of an empire that did not possess a cultural concept for honorable surrender. To them, the silence of the American sailors was not just protocol, it was the chilling quiet before a firing squad. They waited anxiously for MacArthur to step to the microphone and begin the expected tirade, the verbal dismantling of the Japanese state, the demand for the emperor's immediate abdication, and the theatrical condemnation of their war crimes. Instead, General Douglas MacArthur approached the microphone, and the entire psychological dynamic of the surrender shifted in less than 60 seconds. The Supreme Commander did not emerge wearing a dress uniform adorned with rows of shimmering medals. He wore plain, unadorned khaki. His collar was casually open. There was no ceremonial sword strapped to his side. This stripped-down, utilitarian appearance was a deliberate, highly visible signal. The era of combat was over, and the cold business of administration had begun. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no venom, no soaring wartime bravado, and no Churchillian rhetoric. He read from a prepared paper text with a flat, rigid, and strictly procedural cadence. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, MacArthur stated, his voice echoing over the ship's public address system. He explicitly noted that it was not his purpose to meet in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred. As the translation filtered through the Japanese ranks, a profound, almost paralyzing shock rippled through the delegation. The fiery rhetoric of vengeance was entirely absent. MacArthur was not behaving like an avenging conqueror intent on dismantling their culture. He was speaking like a corporate executive outlining the strict terms of a massive administrative merger. He framed the surrender not as the fiery destruction of Japan, but as a rigid, forward-looking legal process. For Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Umezu, the realization was immediate and staggering. The American occupation was not going to be a bloodthirsty purge. It was going to be a vast, cold bureaucracy. This was MacArthur's masterstroke of psychological control. By replacing the terrifying, unpredictable specter of victor's justice with the predictable, mundane rigidity of administrative procedure, he neutralized the enemy's fatalism. The terror that had consumed the Japanese delegation upon their arrival evaporated, rapidly replaced by a cautious, hyper-focused attention to the procedural rules being laid out before them. They realized, in that exact moment, that their physical survival and the survival of their emperor now depended entirely on their strict adherence to the paperwork. MacArthur had dismantled their resistance not with bullets, but with bureaucracy. With the psychological temperature of the deck now carefully regulated, the Supreme Commander initiated the core legal mechanism of the ceremony. Two massive, identical copies of the instrument of surrender lay on the table. One was bound in dark green leather, intended for the Allied powers to keep. The other, bound in rough black canvas, was the copy the Japanese delegation would carry back to Tokyo. But the order in which these historical documents were to be signed was not a matter of casual diplomatic protocol. It was a precise, meticulously designed legal trap aimed at eliminating any future diplomatic ambiguity or revisionism. MacArthur gestured sharply to the Japanese delegation. He dictated that they must sign the documents first. This was a non-negotiable legal sequencing. If a single Allied commander had put his pen to the paper before the Japanese representatives, it could be interpreted under international law as a bilateral agreement, a negotiated treaty between two sovereign equals coming to a mutual understanding. By forcing the Japanese representatives to sign the already drafted, unalterable documents before anyone else moved, the Americans established an undeniable legal framework of absolute, unconditional capitulation. The Japanese were not agreeing to terms. They were submitting to them. They had to legally bind the Japanese state, the military, and the emperor before the Allies would officially acknowledge the end of the war. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu stepped forward first, acting as the official representative of the emperor and the civilian government. The tension on the deck spiked as the immense reality of the physical act set in. Shigemitsu, heavily encumbered by the wooden prosthetic leg he had worn since an assassination attempt in Shanghai 13 years earlier, struggled awkwardly to seat himself at the table. He fumbled with his formal top hat and his cane, laying them aside. As he looked down at the documents, he froze, disoriented by the English-only text, the foreign formatting of the paper, and the overwhelming, crushing pressure of thousands of eyes bearing down on him. He simply could not find the correct blank line for his signature. The seconds ticked by in an agonizing, heavy silence. Among the watching Allied officers, muscles tensed. Was this a stalling tactic? Was the civilian minister attempting a final, petty act of defiance? MacArthur, watching this hesitation from just a few feet away, did not interpret the delay as resistance, but as procedural friction. With cold, surgical efficiency, the Supreme Commander snapped an order to his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland. "Sutherland, show him where to sign." Sutherland immediately stepped forward, leaned aggressively over the shoulder of the Japanese foreign minister, and bluntly pointed his finger directly at the empty line. Shigemitsu retrieved his pen, nervously checked his pocket watch to log the exact historical minute, 9:04 in the morning, and signed his name. With that stroke of ink, the Japanese civilian state surrendered. Next came General Umezu, representing the Imperial General Headquarters. Unlike the foreign minister, Umezu outright refused to sit. He would not allow himself to be photographed occupying the physical seat of the defeated. Instead, he stepped briskly to the table, leaned rigidly over the documents in a tense, upright posture, and aggressively slashed his signature across both the canvas and leather-bound copies. He deliberately minimized his physical contact with the American table, but his personal posture did not change the legal reality. With those two signatures, the Japanese military and civilian leadership were entirely, unconditionally compromised. The trap was sprung. Only after the Japanese had completely signed away their sovereignty did MacArthur step forward to sign as the supreme commander for the Allied powers. The ceremony now shifted seamlessly from a Japanese capitulation into a demonstration of unified global dominance. MacArthur's signing was a carefully choreographed piece of historical theater. He utilized a half-dozen different fountain pens to complete his single signature. After forming the first few letters, he turned and handed the first pen over his shoulder to Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. He then used a second pen and handed it to British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. Both Wainwright and Percival had recently been rescued from Manchurian prisoner-of-war camps. They stood behind MacArthur, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and physically emaciated from years of brutal starvation and abuse at the hands of their captors. This silent, highly visible gesture was the only concession MacArthur made to the profound emotional trauma of the Pacific War. It was a quiet, devastating acknowledgement of Allied suffering, executed without breaking the strict, bloodless administrative decorum of the ceremony. Once MacArthur finished, the relentless machinery of the Allied consensus was put into motion. The Supreme Commander called the representatives of the victorious nations to the table, one by one, to co-sign the document. First, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz stepped forward to sign on behalf of the United States. Then came General Su Young Chang for the Republic of China, followed by Admiral Bruce Fraser for the United Kingdom. Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevyanko stepped up to sign for the Soviet Union. General Thomas Blamey signed for Australia, Colonel Moore Cosgrove for Canada, General Philippe Leclerc for France, Admiral Conrad Helfrich for the Netherlands, and finally, Air Vice Marshal Leonard Izett for New Zealand. For the Japanese delegation, forced to stand in absolute silence and watch this procession, it was the final psychological blow. They were not merely surrendering to the United States Navy, they were being forced to watch the entire industrialized globe line up with terrifying administrative precision to permanently codify their defeat. The physical act of signing presented an unbreakable wall of international consensus. There was no diplomatic daylight left to exploit, no crack in the Allied alliance they could manipulate in the future to negotiate better terms. The entire world was unified against them on a single sheet of paper. As the final New Zealand representative capped his pen and stepped back from the table, the 23-minute ceremony appeared to have been executed flawlessly. MacArthur's orchestration of the physical environment, his brilliant weaponization of procedural restraint, and his strict, unforgiving management of the legal sequencing had successfully dismantled the enemy's fatalism. He had legally secured the occupation of a hostile nation without firing a single shot. The facade of absolute, impenetrable American control was perfect. But as the Japanese delegation stepped forward to retrieve their canvas-bound copy of the treaty and return to the ruined ashes of Tokyo, this perfect facade was about to shatter. A simple, careless human error, committed just seconds earlier by one of the Allied representatives, had quietly derailed the meticulous legal framework, threatening to invalidate the very document that ended the Second World War. As Foreign Minister Shigemitsu stepped forward to collect the black canvas Japanese copy of the treaty, his aides quickly reviewed the parchment. Suddenly, the delegation froze. They refused to step away from the table, and the rigidly choreographed ceremony ground to a jarring, awkward halt. The problem was a mundane clerical error that had triggered a cascading formatting disaster. When it was Canada's turn to sign, Colonel Moore Cosgrave accidentally placed his signature on the wrong line, signing in the space designated for the Republic of France. This forced the French representative to sign on the line for the Netherlands, the Dutch representative signed for New Zealand, and the final New Zealand delegate had to write his name entirely outside the designated margins at the bottom of the page. To the Americans, it was a minor slip of the pen, but to Shigemitsu, it was a terrifying legal flaw. He knew that if he returned to Tokyo and presented a botched, legally inaccurate document to the Imperial Diet, hardline militarists could seize upon the error. They could argue the treaty was procedurally invalid, refusing to recognize the surrender because the Allied signatures did not match the printed sovereign titles. A misplaced signature could literally jeopardize the ceasefire. Seeing the Japanese stubbornly refusing to leave the deck, the psychological tension instantly spiked. The perfect facade of absolute Allied control was unraveling over a formatting error. MacArthur immediately dispatched his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, to neutralize the panic. Sutherland marched to the table. There was no time to draft a new treaty, so he opted for a crude, immediate fix. Drawing his own fountain pen, Sutherland aggressively crossed out the printed names of the Allied nations next to the misplaced signatures. He hastily scribbled the correct countries by hand and stamped his own initials next to the heavy ink scratches. He had just turned the most important diplomatic instrument of the 20th century into a messy, improvised compromise. But the crude corrections satisfied the strict legalism of the Japanese delegation. Shigemitsu accepted the scarred document, yet the flawless momentum of the morning had been broken. With the deck of the Missouri caught in a tense, awkward silence, MacArthur desperately needed an unmistakable concluding action to reassert absolute dominance and permanently close the ceremony. MacArthur stepped back to the microphone, his voice cutting through the lingering tension on the deck. "These proceedings are closed," he announced, projecting a flat administrative finality. It was exactly 9:25 in the morning, and at that precise, meticulously scheduled minute, the heavy, overcast sky above Tokyo Bay began to vibrate. The awkward, suffocating quiet of the bureaucratic entanglement on the veranda deck was instantly shattered by a low, mechanical rumble that quickly escalated into a deafening, chest-rattling roar. MacArthur did not need to orchestrate a gloating victory parade on the wooden planks or deliver a final humiliating diatribe to the Japanese delegation. He let American logistics deliver the final word. Bursting through the low cloud cover came an overwhelming, synchronized armada of American air power. Over 400 B-29 superfortresses, the massive, four-engine heavy bombers that had methodically reduced Japan's industrial infrastructure to ash, swept incredibly low over the battleship. They were followed immediately by hundreds of Navy carrier planes, darkening the sky in a relentless, thundering wave. The sheer volume of the aircraft drowned out all human conversation. The ship's steel superstructure physically trembled under the acoustic weight of thousands of aviation engines operating in flawless unison. This was MacArthur's true, undeniable message. It was a cold, calculated display of absolute technological, industrial, and mechanical supremacy that required no translation and left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. The stark contrast was devastating. Down on the deck, the end of the war had been awkwardly finalized with scratched-out ink and frantic clerical corrections. But up in the sky, the reality of the American victory was an apocalyptic, flawless machine. For Foreign Minister Shigemitsu and General Umezu, standing rigid beneath the shadows of the passing bombers, this final spectacle erased any lingering thoughts of the clerical error. The deafening roar cemented their psychological subjugation far more effectively than a forced bow or a verbal dressing down ever could. The display locked the physical reality of their total defeat into place, while concluding the ceremony exactly on the Supreme Commander's schedule, permanently reasserting his absolute dominance over the situation. As the endless formations of aircraft roared toward the horizon, and the Japanese delegation slowly descended the starboard ladder to return to the ruined ashes of Tokyo, the message was unmistakable. This overwhelming, mechanical display of power over the bay was not just the closing act of a 23-minute ceremony. It served as the definitive, unyielding blueprint for the years of occupation that followed. The deafening roar of the aircraft faded, leaving only the quiet reality of MacArthur's subdued opening words. The lack of righteous vengeance on the deck of the Missouri had not been a sudden bout of mercy, nor a failure of resolve. It was a highly calibrated psychological operation. By strictly regulating the physical environment and refusing to publicly degrade the defeated leadership, MacArthur laid the exact blueprint for the American occupation of Japan. He recognized that true power at the end of a devastating conflict is not wielded through theatrical humiliation, but through ironclad administration. by treating the capitulation as a cold, bureaucratic transaction, and by allowing the emperor to remain intact as a compliant figurehead, the supreme commander achieved what brute force alone could not guarantee. He successfully bypassed the terrifying threat of a bloody, drawn-out guerrilla resistance across the Japanese home islands. Instead of fighting a bitter insurgency in the mountains and rubble, the vastly outnumbered American vanguard was able to walk into Tokyo and initiate rapid, sweeping demilitarization. They dismantled the imperial war machine and fundamentally reformed the Japanese constitution by issuing orders through the very government they had just defeated. The historical contrast was absolute. The horrifying, island-hopping slaughter that had defined the previous 4 years was abruptly replaced by a highly disciplined, bloodless conquest. The ceremony on the Missouri was not merely the final chapter of the Second World War. Built on logistics, meticulous preparation, and a pragmatic awareness of the enemy's culture, it stands as the first highly successful psychological operation of the post-war era. It proved that the ultimate military triumph lay not in publicly breaking a nation's spirit, but in meticulously managing its survival. MacArthur understood that the ultimate demonstration of power wasn't found in crushing a defeated enemy beneath his boot. It was found in calmly dictating the exact terms of their survival.